evening. It doesn't feel like evening. It's such a beautiful, light-filled moment out there. And it was a great pleasure to see many friends coming in the door. So I think doing this programming back live is really a joy for us, and I hope it is for you as well. So thank you for cooperating with the constraints that we still have to make sure that we are as safe and as healthy as possible. We appreciate you keeping your masks on in the auditorium. I'm taking mine off when I'm speaking, and Andrew and Samir, of course, will as well. And I ask you also that little moment of housekeeping to turn off your cell phones, because we've all gotten out of the habit of doing that. So I'm going to give the briefest of introductions to people who have far more interesting things to say than I do, even when talking about them. So we're delighted to welcome back award-winning writers Andrew Weiner and Samir Pandya for this first in a series of 3 related parallel stories exploring connections between art forms, allowing us to see those influences at work in the process of composition, forgive me, the performance of music, and the poetry of narrative from the 19th century to the present day. And I hope many of you have been able to go upstairs and have seen the Van Gogh exhibition, Through Vincent's Eyes, Van Gogh and His Sources, which reconnects this iconic artist to his 19th century context and invites us to consider the artist, musicians, and writers he admired. Tonight, Samir and Andrew share their own influences, taking their cue from Vincent and adding a contemporary twist. I'm so sorry. What happens when the cultural seeps into the personal creative process? What passions emerge when creators fall under the influence of art forms other than the one they practice? Are, as Van Gogh said, books and reality the same thing? Do our influencers become part of our voice, an extension of our hand? So please join me in welcoming to the stage these longtime friends who have been instrumental in building parallel stories and other writing-centered programming for our museum. Many of you have expressed to us your thanks for offering those programs, and I in turn offer my thanks to Samir and Andrew for their part in making them so exceptional. So tonight they will examine these questions through a lens of creativity and also criticism. So please join me in welcoming Samir Pandya and Andrew Weiner. Thank you both.
Hello.
Hello, hi. Hey Andrew, how you doing?
How are you, Samir?
I'm okay. Thank you all for being here. You know I'm still trying to figure out kind of being up in person with, in front of people, which seems so easy a couple of years ago, which seems very different now. But thank you all for being here. And I thought what Andrew and I would do today, in some ways, what Patsy asked us to do was to think about this show and then to think about the ways in which the show could help us think about the kinds of influences Andrew and I share, have very different influences. And so I think before we talk about us, I wonder, you want to tell me about the show, what you thought of it, what you thought of what the show was trying to do? One of the things, right, the name of this program, Shadow Art, Influences and Inspirations, I thought we could start by talking about exactly what influences and inspirations are.
Is the curator here? Yes? No? Are we safe? No, I mean, I thought it was tremendous to have the work here and the paintings. I think that it's tricky always to do this kind of show, actually. I think it's nice to see some of the work that another painter was looking at. And I think that can provide some kind of understanding, but I don't think it actually goes to the root of how what actually happens for an artist in their practice. So I hope that we'll sort of
Yeah.
actually get to that. What were you?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you what happens with an artist, right?
Yeah.
But maybe what I can say about it's interesting. I was thinking, I'm coming closer to 50, and in some ways, answering these questions are easier the older you get, right? In a sense that I think if I was thinking about influences and inspirations when I was younger, I think I would tend to draw straighter lines between things, and I think as I've been thinking about us gathering here today, I think what I've really come to realize is how squiggly all these lines are, right? And what I mean by them being squiggly is that there is seldom, I think, a one-to-one correlation between me liking The Sun Also Rises when I was a sophomore in college and me doing the writing that I'm doing now, right? Like, I could make some kind of line between the two, but they're just harder lines to make, right? And I think what the show upstairs is trying to do, which I admire quite a bit, is to kind of shake Van Gogh out of this kind of cult of individuality that I think he has been ensconced in for so long, particularly him, right? Which is that this idea that he is sui generis, that he does what he does entirely on his own, right? And I think the benefits of a show like this is, in some ways, it's its own kind of art criticism that is occurring, right? Which is, it is saying that none of this is kind of solo in this way. And it was in this kind of larger context that I think I began to think about this. But I want you to answer that question as well.
Well, I just got back from Paris, and I was looking at a Delacroix in Saint Sulpice, the church in Paris, and the painting was so loose, and I used to be a painter, or I still am sort of a painter, and it occurred to me that what Van Gogh needed was permission to loosen up his arm and use his shoulder and his elbow and start making thick impasto strokes instead of fine, lots of tiny little careful strokes that are more typical of academic painting. And it occurred to me, well, he easily could have just looked at a Delacroix because that was very available to see, and suddenly that's all he needs and he's off and running. So that's one thing, I think, that it often just takes a small little thing that seems tertiary, but that changes everything for you. And once you have a paradigm shift, the way he did, you run with that as an artist. I guess the other thing I was thinking of, though, with Van Gogh is Yale Press put out a number of years ago, and I think it's in the show, a multi-volume set, very expensive and beautifully produced, of all of his paintings, and they kind of situate them on the page with his letters. So you see what he was thinking while he was making certain paintings. And if you read that entire kind of set of volumes, the overall impression you get is, in fact, that his main influence is religion, actually, and theology, and Christianity, and that's what you don't see in a show like this. They're very. I highly recommend reading his letters, which I actually think are on parallel in terms of greatness to his paintings. I know that's a big statement, but the letters are absolutely extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with this idea that creativity is in the understandings and the mechanics of it are well above our pay grade.
Yeah.
I thought what Andrew and I basically did was we sent each other images of things, and so we were going to go through some of these images, and I'm going to let Andrew start with these two.
Yeah, we didn't talk about these beforehand, so we're doing this extemporaneously now. So I have Richard Pryor up here and Sinatra, and I guess the thing I want to say is that Pryor was one of the first influences on me. You know, maybe the first profound narrative influence on me, and Sinatra much later, and for very different reasons. And yet, when I put them together like this, I realized that they both are ancient voices. Actually, both of them. There's something about the way that they delivered what they delivered that seems very, very old, and very deeply connected to the human in a way that is not anachronistic. It's not specific to any time. And the other thing I think about, especially with Pryor, is that in terms of influence, when we really talk about influence, and you see this with Van Gogh, when he talks about Millet and some of the other painters he loved, is influence is a form of love, it sees to me. And this, I think, applies to any of our lives. When we love something, you know, as Saul Bellow said, a writer is a reader who is moved to emulation, right? So we see something and we want to respond to that something in the same, we actually want to try to do that. So anyway, I think one of the key ingredients of a person like a performer like Pryor was actually love. What he has and what some other comedians lack is love. It seems to me a kind of a warmth and vulnerability and all these kind of qualities of pain and honesty. At any rate, so that's Pryor. But the other thing that I think connects these two is the use of irony. And I feel like before I even knew what irony was, I absorbed it from Richard Pryor. And then much later, I came to Sinatra. And I didn't actually appreciate Sinatra in a real way until I was much older. And what I realized, I don't think I would have understood Sinatra if I hadn't read Chekhov. Because Chekhov writes a lot about how to direct actors, for example, and how to deal with sentiment. So Chekhov would say to an actor, if you're saying "I love you," you have to say it as if you hate them, right? And that's Sinatra, actually. Sinatra sings all these songs that should be very cheesy and kind of saccharine, actually. Some of the lyrics are not very good as pieces of art, right? Just the words. But he transforms them into absolute extraordinary songs. And it's because he sings against the sentiment. He sings against the grain. And that's why some of the songs are so brutal. They actually are really hard to deal with in some ways. So that kind of dissonance, actually, that Sinatra achieved is what distinguished him from, for example, who was the other? Was it Bing Crosby and some of the other crooners of his day? Somehow he instinctually understood contrast, right? Yeah, so that's what I have to say about those two.
Pryor was quite confrontational, right? As a performer, right? And so is there something about the sense of confrontation that struck you as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think that, he kind of almost, along with Lenny Bruce, I think that Pryor is the one who broke comedy wide open and started telling the truth, right? And but they tell the truth through exaggeration and shock in a way. No one had ever seen the kind of things that Pryor was saying on television, for example. But in a way, you could say that he was reflective of something that was changing in the culture as well. So, and that's the other thing that I think we need to say is that, and Patsy mentioned it, was that you work on you develop your art, but you can't help, you are also a product in some way of, as I think Patsy said, the seepage of your time and the culture seeps into your work. So I think Pryor was definitely had his, hooks into cultural change that was happening, starting with, Vietnam and, civil rights, Vietnam, et cetera. Yeah. Oh, did you do that?
I just did that, yeah.
So can I just say, Samir, when you sent me this, I thought I laughed, and I thought it was anyway. I'm just very curious to know what I have no idea what you're going to say about Black Sabbath.
I don't either. So. So this is, when Patsy suggested we do this, this was in fact the first thing I thought of, right? Now, let me explain to you. And I think that there's a way in which, there are so many ways in which we are different from Van Gogh. One of which is that, for me personally, music has been, I think, the central force in thinking about creativity, right? It's because I think in a certain way, as a younger person, you tend to individuate through music primarily, right? You might be a kid that says, I'm going to read, Proust, and this is how I'm going to be different from the other junior high kids, right? But mostly it's music, right? And I arrived in America when I was 8 in the 3rd grade. I went to a particular elementary school for 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and then I tested out, which they could call it that then, I don't think they call it that now, into a gifted classroom, okay? And I arrived at a gifted classroom with all sorts of other students at a different school with all these other gifted students. And a group of us began listening to heavy metal, right? And what was so interesting, just imagine for a second, if you can, me at the age of 12, 4 years in this country, listening to Ozzy Osbourne, and my immigrant parents kind of listening to it in the background, right? Which is, I'd love the thought bubbles over that, right? Now, what is interesting to me about it is that what marked heavy metal for me early on was a voice of marginalization, right? So these 4 gentlemen were from Birmingham, right? They were born poor after the war in England that had completely post-industrialized, right? So we know the Beatles, we know the Rolling Stones as a much more polished set of young men that came out of England in that era, right? But Black Sabbath is something very, very different, right? And I think I remember hearing it for the first time and in a strange way finding a great amount of solace in the noise, right? It's because what it does is it helps you say, I feel different, and here's a way of articulating this difference, which is in some ways quite different from the way these guys are articulating these differences, right? As an adult, when I listened to this first album, this is their second album that came out in 1970. It's a profoundly political album, right? And its opening song is a song called War Pigs. So they're not the most subtle band in the world, but they do their job. Now, part of the reason I wanted to bring it up and why it has been so interesting. So on one hand, this very idea became incredibly important to me, right? Now, this album comes out in 1970. 2 years before, the British politician Enoch Powell gives a very now infamous speech, the River of Blood speech that he gives in Birmingham about the influx of immigrants into England in the 50s and 60s, right? Profoundly racist. And his audience in Birmingham eats it up, right? And he becomes this very, very popular yet divisive figure in England of the 1970s. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is part of the reason why influence is so complicated is that the very kind of thing that shapes the way you think about, in my example, notions of difference and marginality, that the artwork itself can at the same time be incredibly problematic, right? So that there is a way in which the core of the discourse of difference that this band was articulating in 1970 in some ways was premised on a certain working class white rage, right? which was premised on the exclusion of kind of those Indians and Pakistanis that moved to England after decolonization, right? And so I'm not here to give you a history lesson. I'm just here to say that why I picked this is the things you love are not always the things that love you back, right? That the art that you hang on to, the art that you find incredibly important, right? Ozzy became a joke afterwards, right? Like he and his wife did, some of the earliest kind of reality television shows. And yet this album still I go back to over and over again, right? And that's a funny thing about art and artists is they can do something really incredible and then they can just turn left and never veer back right again. And I think that that's part of what I kind of found interesting about this. But you and I both grew up in the East Bay. You didn't have a metal moment in Hayward?
Not a single one. No, I was.
Yeah.
No, it was all soul when I'm a little bit older than you, so it was all soul music actually.
And is there a way in which music
and Journey? I mean, Journey was the Journey was the biggest band in the Bay Area. And then I went straight to the Clash and Bowie and all that stuff. So.
But is there something about the form of music in terms of influence that you think is separate from kind of the poets that we'll talk about later?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. I mean, I don't know I'm not sure what you're asking actually.
I'm asking. Yeah. You're a novelist.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly easy stretch for me to say, Andrew, what are the 5 novels that you found important that we can say they appear in your work over and over in different ways, right? Music is a genre that you listen to not as work, but as something else. And I'm curious you're talking about seepage, how does it seep in?
Yeah, so what I'll say is my equivalent to your Black Sabbath is more the kind of punk scene. So when I moved to LA, punk was very much a movement in Los Angeles. And it was the idea that you were against something. And really it was music that taught me, like with Sabbath, I guess with you, that kind of music taught me that there was something wrong with culture, there was something wrong with society, and your job was to be against it in some way and to be upset about it. Whether it was bands like the Dead Kennedys and things like that, who were very political actually. What's interesting now is that I teach, and I teach students, and my students don't really have the sense that they don't identify with music as a way to be against the culture. They like every era of music. They're much more open than we are. I mean, if you were in Los Angeles in the early 80s, for example, you were against the Beatles. You hated the Beatles. You hated Journey. You hated all those bands, and you only liked certain punk bands.
Yeah, as a way of kind of creating a certain form of identity.
You create yourself.
Yeah.
Very smooth, this transition.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a bloke named Dostoevsky, and so this is actually in line with what you were saying, Samir, is that Dostoevsky's not my writer, actually. He's not my favorite writer. He's not the one that I turn to. And yet he had this major impact on me in my work. And so that's the example of what you're saying, is they don't love you back necessarily. And I think this is something I love what you said, and it's a very important thing to say now to people, because there's kind of an idea now in the culture that your heroes have to be perfect, right? And otherwise you can't look up to them. So with Dostoevsky, what he taught me, and which I just think is so extraordinary, is that you can have arguments with yourself. You can disagree with yourself in profound ways, and that's okay. And furthermore, that you can actually work that out in your art. So Dostoevsky really had competing ideas about things like God, humiliation versus humility, honor, how to be a person, all these kind of, and very much politics, you know, the czar and the proletariat and all these things. He wasn't sure what he thought a lot of the time, and so what he did is he instilled each character, in a way, in any one novel with one of those arguments in almost its pure form. So to read a Dostoevsky novel is to read a massive, massive argument that's going on between all these different characters. And that's really freeing. It frees you up from being ideologically committed as an artist, anyway. Yeah, that's why I picked Dostoevsky.
We were, right before we were doing this, we were talking about there's been a rise in the short novel, right, where people are tending to publish novels that are, we were talking about Gatsby, and like the word count for The Great Gatsby is something ridiculous like 40,000 words, right? It's a very, very short novel, right? Dostoevsky did not write short novels.
No, it's funny. I mean, I don't know if how much the audience knows about Dostoevsky, but he was actually writing because he was paying off gambling debts. I mean, that his main dilemma was his gambling problem. So he would do things like hawk his wife's wedding ring that he bought her to get some gambling money, and then he'd lose it all. And so his solution was to write installments and make money off the chapters. So I think he wrote lengthy novels because he was actually writing them in pieces very quickly in gambling centers like Baden-Baden. You know, he'd go gamble all day, and then the wife would say, "We have no money," and he'd come home and write another chapter, and send it off. You know.
So maybe The Idiot is in fact, his autobiography.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, it is just this interesting thing, right? Which is that those books ask of you something.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure I'm up to anymore, you know?
Yeah, I feel differently. I mean, that's the other thing I'll say about Dostoevsky is that I feel that his books take life very seriously. They have a kind of wild acceptance of being a human. So they're very forgiving. In fact, I would argue that Brothers Karamazov is about forgiveness in a major kind of way. So the first time I read Brothers Karamazov, I mean, I say he's not my favorite writer, he's not, but when I read that book, it was one of those moments, sort of like when I first read Moby Dick, where I started kind of almost having to make a loud noise of joy, because there are moments in that book that just are extraordinary, and not even in a literary way, not as a novel, but as a piece of wisdom, right? It's like Dostoevsky, his books are a mess. I mean, he wrote hastily. His dialogue is almost ridiculous half the time. It's very exaggerated. Compared to Tolstoy, it's like he's on cocaine, you know. But despite all that, there's something in his soul. Somehow his being comes across the transom and manifests on the pages. And his soul was, in many ways, very beautiful, the arguments that it was having with itself about all kinds of things. So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, your use of the word favorite is an interesting use of the term, right? Which is when you said he is not my favorite novelist, right?
No.
And I think about that word, which is favorite, right? Like it's like saying someone's your best friend, right? It's a lot of pressure to put on that person, right? And in a way, to call something your favorite is a lot of pressure, right? And I'm kind of trying for us to think through what exactly that term means, right? And I think, at least for me, I wonder if the nature of one's favoriteness is that there is something embedded in the work that you return to over and over again, because whether you know it or not, right, there are a set of themes, there are a set of ideas, there are a set of characters that you find consciously and unconsciously really important to you.
Yeah, I would almost argue important, but also comforting. So some of with music, with any of people I think of as my heroes, they affirm my value system. I think they affirm my view of the world in a way that brings sanity. It seems sane.
Yeah.
It brings sanity to what is often feels like a life that is very mad.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not arguing against your desire for comfort.
Yeah.
But is there a way in which going to things for comfort? I mean, that it is in a sense, right? That if it provides you comfort, what it does is it says, here, you are not going to be challenged when you return to this, right? That some of the core things that you believe in, you can come here for that core belief to be reaffirmed.
Yeah, but I would modify that a little bit, because let's say there's an artist that I love, and I actually love her too. They can bring me comfort, and yet if they're so good at what they do, that's unsettling almost, because I want to be that good. So they still can present a challenge as to the degree that their art is achieved and succeeds on its own terms. That feels like it actually makes me anxious.
Yeah.
Because you think, can I do that as well?
Yeah.
So.
So this is the second piece that I picked, and I will be honest with you, I know it very little, right? Meaning that the other pieces that I've picked here, I know very intimately. And Kelmans is someone who I have come to way more recently, right? This is Lithuanian-American artist who has I think in the last 10, 15 years has gotten, I think, the fame I think she deserves. And these pieces, and I think the way just the projection works, I don't think it quite does justice to basically these pieces that she does in charcoal and pencil. And of course, when you look at it, it looks like a photograph, right? And you look a little closer at it and you're like, indeed, it is not a photograph, right? And you begin to see the idiosyncrasies of the kinds of sketchings that she does, right? And when I say that I don't know the work very well is I think one of the things that I've come to appreciate about influence is sometimes it's perfectly okay to not know something exceptionally well. And it's actually a good thing if, in this case, I've not read much about her, I've not done any of that, right? It's because, I know that one of the things that she is interested in is memory and perception, right? And it is an idea about memory, for me, in kind of all sorts of various contexts, I have found great interest in, right? Like the things that you remember because they are somebody else's memory, right? And I think there's I can't remember her name, there's a literary critic at Columbia who's written quite beautifully on Art Spiegelman, and she refers to him as his work as post-memory. This idea that he is memorializing stories that he himself has never experienced, right? And I think that is a part of what has always drawn me to her, right? Because I think that is what her work is suggesting, right? This idea that the things that seem mimetic, the things that seem like they are perfectly reflected, are in fact not reflected at all. I'm curious what your interest has been.
Well, I almost want to save it because she's very related to another painter that I've got coming up.
Okay.
But I'll just say that to see one of her shows in person, I'm not sure if you had that.
Yeah, I did.
Opportunity. It's extraordinary because you walk into a clean gallery and these paintings are not very big.
They're tiny, yeah.
They're very small, and you walk around the room and they're the quietest shows I've ever. Her shows have always been so quiet.
Quiet meaning people are not speaking, or
no one's speaking. I mean, you don't speak in one of her shows because it feels like it would pollute the space. The paintings are, as I said, small, and they have a softness to them, and so they almost trick you, because then you get up close, and there's a fierceness to her technique. Her technique is absolutely, it's strict, and it's, she has a method, and she works very, very slowly, very carefully, and makes these paintings that do look like photos, but they're always of things like, I mean, if you just look at this, any one part of this it takes days and days and days, weeks and months to make a painting like this. So there's something shocking about her technique. Mm-hmm. And the dedication to reproduce a photographic image. And that's something I think I want to save for the next conversation.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, so on the left is one of the great opera singers of the 60s, really the 60s and 50s in Europe, Gundula Janowitz, and that's Karajan, the famous director, who is problematic. Karajan was one of the conductors who decided that it was okay to conduct he was very young, but he kind of came up under while Germany was in the throes of the National Socialists. And he never sort of said, kind of like Heidegger, he never said sorry or anything. And he was able to perform still and conduct. But he worked with Gundula from the time she was very young, and did these. And I think I came to her voice through Richard Strauss's last four songs, and Strauss's last four songs are his elegy, basically, for a Europe that was destroyed by the Nazis. So. And what's interesting about those songs is that they're set to poems that aren't even extraordinary, actually. It doesn't matter, because they're transformed, like I said earlier, by the singer and by Richard Strauss's music into these kind of dipping and soaring works of such beauty that you feel, they somehow make you feel part of, at least in part, what was lost. They're kind of looking back on what was, forever lost in the suicide that Europe basically committed. So that's, and there's something about the last four songs that arguably Jessye Norman is perhaps a greater singer, but there's something about her recording that affects me more than the Jessye Norman recording. And I probably have listened to no other piece of music more than the last four songs recorded by her and Karajan. On the right is David Bowie in a dress. And I include him because Bowie was, I would say Bowie and Pryor were the first two big influences on me. And Bowie basically saved my life in my last year in high school. When I had a kind of a crisis of who am I and what am I going to do and that kind of thing. And so he opened up basically everything to me and showed me that you can create yourself and create different identities and have a life as a single artist, not in a band. And each time you go out, you do something radically new. Mm-hmm. But just the fact that he was wearing a dress, and so I started wearing a dress, and did all that. And at any rate, the reason I put them together is because around the time that Bowie died, and it wasn't that long ago, I came across a piece in Rolling Stone of an interview with him. Turns out Bowie was extremely intelligent. At any rate, they asked him what was his favorite piece of music. And I was astonished to see that he said, I have listened to Gundula Janowitz's last four songs every single morning of my life since I discovered it in 1972. So here was my hero that in no way did I associate with, Richard Strauss and opera and things like that, who happened to love the same exact piece of music. And so that was very affirming to have a very different kind of artist that I admired love the same work. Yeah.
And was it a surprise?
It was a surprise.
Why is that?
Because there was nothing. I had no indication in Bowie's oeuvre that he even listened to opera or classical music even. So yeah.
And I mean, maybe I'm only asking that is I think maybe it's part of for me the point I'm returning for myself over and over again, right? Which is that these are these kind of squiggly lines, right? Like a part of the narrative arc of this particular story you told was, right, like is the reveal of it is the surprise, right? That this is what he would be listening to. This is what he listened to over and over again.
Yeah.
And I guess perhaps part of the point you are also trying to make is that maybe some of this stuff just shouldn't be a surprise, right? And I think that why, in a way, the mapping that is being done upstairs with Van Gogh is so necessary, but then also so incredibly difficult, right? To do that kind of mapping of what influence and creativity looks like.
I'll just say, and I want to add to that I think another lesson to take from this, and I take it to heart in my own work, is high and low. Mm-hmm. That usually the kind of music that Karajan and Janowitz produced is considered this sort of elite, in the classical realm. And Bowie was a pop rock artist, and yet it all came together suddenly when I read that interview. And that made sense to me, and it taught me something that I think was worth being reminded of, which is that any art worth its salt can actually inhabit an entire range of the social realm. Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about the high and low. Yeah. I think we have a group of more slides, and I think we're going to go through them a little bit faster now, so that we can kind of, you're all being very patient. We'd love, I think the best part is being able to chat with you about it. So this is, after I kind of got on Andrew for having favorite novels, this is my favorite novel, which is a really remarkable, V.S. Naipaul is, and this is a trend now, which is, V.S. Naipaul, by all accounts, was a terrible, terrible man, right? He was born in Trinidad in 1930, went on, got a fellowship. His family had come as indentured servants to Trinidad in the late 19th century. Naipaul got one of these singular fellowships that were given to the Commonwealth countries, like one fellowship a year, and he won it from Trinidad to go to Oxford. I think he went in 1950, finished in 1954, and I think produced 30 books and won a Nobel Prize and died several years ago, right? And Naipaul, what I find interesting about him is that if an artist is lucky and productive, he or she will have periods, right? So Naipaul had the funny period of his first kind of the 50s and 60s where he wrote about his family in Trinidad. He went really dark in the middle period when he wrote about decolonizing Africa. And, in those books, Bend in the River, Guerrillas in a Free State, he has been justly and unjustly criticized for, right? He does not, his eye towards decolonization has not been, has been quite strong, right? Basically suggesting that the failures of African nations and other decolonized nations is a failure of their making as opposed to a failure of a larger colonial history. This is this book that came out in 1987, and it's interesting. De Chirico, the Italian painter, painted a series of kind of these remarkable works, a lot of which he did not give names to, right? And the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire went and gave names to these different paintings, right? This is this remarkable idea that you can produce all this work and a great poet can come in and give them kind of titles that you did not know how to give them, right? So he gives this particular piece that's on the cover of the book, The Enigma of Arrival, which is kind of what Naipaul takes it from. And the lesson for me in Naipaul is a deeply autobiographical writer without ever having written an autobiography, right? And this book is the one in which he kind of talks about his own migration from Trinidad to England and him kind of living in a cottage outside of Wiltshire as he is writing this book and watching this kind of garden grow. And in many ways, it's like a Seinfeld episode, right? Like nothing happens in the book. And yet...
It's not quite like a Seinfeld.
Not quite.
This novel is not like a Seinfeld.
Yeah. But it is this book that I've returned to over and over again is because what makes it my favorite is Naipaul's voice, right? And what's so weird about loving a voice is that if you love a voice incredibly as much as I love Naipaul's voice, you know you can't imitate it, right? Like a voice like that is not meant, in my sense of it, for imitation. It is just meant for kind of awe or appreciation, right? And I do think this notion, this phrase autofiction gets used a lot. And Andrew and I have had a conversation ad nauseum about this. It's often attributed to, I think, a remarkable German novelist, W.G. Sebald, who wrote these series of books that are all about W.G. Sebald, and they're kind of moving through these landscapes that he is traveling. And I would just like to make a humble argument that this precedes Sebald by many years. And it's just, it's a favorite novel of mine. And the one thing that I want to add, earlier this week I went to go see the writer Vivian Gornick, who was on campus. And she wrote this terrific memoir called Fierce Savage. I can't remember what it is, but she was talking about the importance of rereading books that are really important to you. And she gave this talk on the importance of rereading Jude the Obscure. And as incredibly kind of eloquent as she was, I had no interest in rereading Jude the Obscure. But it was something I thought about, which was this idea that you need to revisit books. And I sometimes fear that I don't necessarily want to revisit this book because I think, what happens if I don't like it as much as I seem to kind of want to like it?
I think you'll like it. It's a very beautiful, it's an extraordinary book.
Yeah.
So I think you'll like it.
Again?
Again,
Yes.
yeah. All right, let's go to
All right.
Aha. Okay, so this is these are paintings by this artist Gerhard Richter, and these are what I meant by related to Selman's. So Richter has two modes of work. He does photorealism. This was his wife turned away, Betty. This was his second wife with their baby. And Richter showed me a way to, that he basically said, because there was this idea when I was in school that the sublime, ideas of the sublime and romanticism, dead, gone, not possible in the postmodern world. And here comes a painter who says, actually, you can still paint the sublime, but you have to find a technique and a process that somehow has taken something from our moment, right? So he takes sort of the idea of mechanical reproduction, of photography, the blurred photo, found photos, and applies that to these, to canvas. These are all, his paintings are very melancholic, similar to Selman's. And you want to look at them, you can't not look at them. There's something about reproducing a photograph, because that's what he does. He takes photos and he paints from the photo. He does not paint from real life. But there's something about that technique, that once removed or even twice removed, that gives him permission. In one way, behind everything that we're talking about, Samir, I feel like is this idea of permission. Mm-hmm. That can I actually make this work that that I want to make. Yeah. The other work that Richter does are his abstract paintings, and the way he makes those is he slops on some color, and he says it doesn't matter what the first color is, and then he starts scraping it, and he adds more color and he scrapes. And I realized after studying him, and there's a wonderful documentary on how he makes these paintings, that he he actually is speaking to the idea of accident and chance. Because what happens is he'll make a scrape across the canvas, and suddenly this streak of yellow that he had forgotten was underneath, or that he didn't even know was there, appears, and he says, now I have to react to this new condition, right? The new conditions of the work. And this is, I think it's a great model for writing. I find that if I introduce some kind of element that doesn't seem to belong, I now have to react to that. And my fix of it, sort of like an oyster with a grain of sand, however I deal with that irritant, you know, and you see this in jazz too, that suddenly the page can come alive. So, the other thing is, of course, it's almost his method, his technique, is a perfect metaphor for editing. It seems to me.
Yes, exactly.
Because there's this funny moment in the documentary on him where he's spending all this. It's this painting actually. The process of even getting to this, the painting changes color many times, and his wife comes in, and there's an art critic there, and the wife makes a kind of sarcastic remark. It's going to be a white painting, don't worry. And sure enough, after all this, I mean, he could have stopped at any point and it would have been a finished painting. He sells these things for more than $2 million a pop. Sure enough, he covers the whole thing with white, and that's the finished painting. So, yeah.
I'm going to be very brief, and this is the first album I bought in college. And the literary critic Fredric Jameson has this great distinction he makes between what he calls parody and pastiche, right? So parody, of course, we all know is, you know, Saturday Night Live since 1975, right? Is the desire to make fun, right? And what he describes as pastiche is this notion that there's nothing new left, right? There's nothing new left to create. There are no new stories to tell, right? I think I use this line in teaching every time, and I don't even know if Dostoevsky said it or Balzac said it or if nobody said it. But I always say there are only two stories, which is a stranger comes to town and a man goes on a journey, right? Those are it. And we just riff off of those over and over and over again, right? And what Jameson says is that what is so interesting about art and music and literature since 1970 is that the things that work well as pastiche is the mixing of different story forms, right? What Andrew and I were talking about, which is I can't manage 400 pages of high anymore, meaning that I can't sit and say I am going to, and as much as I like it, I'm going to sit and read Moby Dick, and I'm just going to consume it for all 400 of those pages. That my own desire to how I read and how I engage is to move between high and low, right? And what has been so influential to me about this genre of what we call hip hop, right, is hip hop has been masterful at pastiche, right? The very notion of sampling. You hear something, you're like, I know what that is, and then it switches on to something completely different, right? It is a word play that it engages in. It's a stylistic play that it engages in. And I think that is one of the things that has been incredibly important, right? This idea, your point about Richter, right? That you can just scrape stuff off. You can keep scraping stuff off. And kind of in your ear, you can just hear the scraping in different kinds of ways.
I don't know if everyone can see what the quote is. This is just a still from a film and called Tokyo Story by his name is Ozu Yasuhiro or Yasujiro actually, the great Japanese filmmaker of the mid-century, the 20th century. He's kind of the post-war Japanese master, and his films are deeply affecting. They're very quiet. And they taught me that kindness can still be something that you make art about. As you can see, I'm not the nice woman she thought I was. This character, Noriko, played by the great actress, and I can't remember her name right now, but Noriko is one of the most noble characters in all of narrative that I've ever encountered, and yet she's saying things like this. So modesty, self-sacrifice, these kind of values that we don't value anymore. Ozu gives me permission to still write about such things. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're at 6:30.
Yeah.
So I think what I thought I would do is I would just kind of click through the remaining 3 or 4 slides that we have.
Yeah.
If there's one.
It's a drive-by.
It's a drive-by,
Yeah.
which is, this is me, this is Ralph Ellison in his Harlem apartment, and this is John Cheever without his shoes on. And, contemporary writers who wrote about invisibility, I think, in very, very different ways. Ellison, who did it explicitly during his lifetime, and of course, Cheever, who we learned about in his journals well after he'd passed away. That, the master of heterosexual suburban fiction was in fact kind of deeply closeted for much of his life. And I think this is
This
the
is
last
it.
one.
Yeah, we're going to end on Adam Zagievsky, who was on this very stage. He's now no longer in the world. I mourn his loss every day. He changed my life, both on the page and off the page. And he taught me that historical consciousness is very important, and that you can be very serious about things like dignity and kindness and still have an incredible wit. He was very funny, Adam. And he was also one of the great poets ever. So that's it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. We're happy to take questions. If questions are not, whatever. We'd love to open it up if there's any kind of disagreements or agreements or additions that you'd like to make. Andrew and I would be happy to hear them. Yeah, please.
Why nothing from the 21st century?
Andrew.
I'm hard pressed actually to think of something, oddly enough. I think that it's not that there haven't been works of art in the 21st century that have been that I value, but if we're talking about influence, influence tends to be something that happens mostly when you're younger. So I guess we're simply not young enough to be 21st century. Art takes time. It takes a long time to figure out. The culture sorts out things that seem valuable, and it rediscovers things. It brings things back. So that whether it's rediscovering or just kind of an agreement about what's good, you need years. So I think that would be my answer. Yeah.
I think I do not underestimate how much anxiety rules my life and how much anxiety rules the way in which I produce art, the way in which consume art, right? And I don't like that about myself, right? It's not a great thing. I could tell you all sorts of 21st century things that I love, right? Given the time, I think we could talk about Get Out, the horror film, which I found incredibly freeing when I was writing this novel that I published a couple of years ago, right? So I could do that. Part of the reason I brought up this question of anxiety is that part of what's really hard about reading contemporary work is you want to read contemporary work to know what is being produced, but you're also really nervous about. I find myself easily influenced by other people's voices, right? And so I think that it's a really interesting question, right? So it is not that it is absent, but I think the things that I have picked, they're at a safe distance so I can consume them in a different kind of way, right? And I suspect, I think it would have been an interesting kind of project if Patsy had asked us to say, pick only things in the last 20 years, right? It would have been, a very different kind of conversation, but I think a conversation nevertheless.
I'll just add that another way to talk about influence is what you're stealing from others.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the honest thing. And so it's much safer to steal from the dead, and you won't get sued, you won't get called on it. It's pretty much what artists have always done throughout history. It is exactly what they've done, actually. So you don't want to steal from your peers and from people of your time. Yeah. Yes, you have a question.
I just wanted to mention that in your introduction, Millet influenced him when he did the Soar. And when you look at that painting then afterwards by Van Gogh, you see exactly the same position, the same movement. And so I was very happy to see that even great, great artists steal from others. And you just mentioned that again. I wonder if writers do the same. How can you be so creative that everything is different and new?
It's writers absolutely do it. The Great Gatsby is one big ripoff. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary books, but he was so good at stealing. No, I mean, and then Graham Greene stole from him and wrote extraordinary books too. So it is, in a way, it's not bad. It's love. It's love. Yeah.
With copyright laws.
Right.
But I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, but I do think you're making a fascinating point, which is maybe influence is us soft pedaling what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Right. That there is. I mean, I think what you were noticing about that, right? Which is, I mean, I brought up Cheever, right? Like, I often, my favorite Cheever story is the first story in his big collection called "Goodbye, My Brother," and it has the most remarkable last paragraph in a short story that I know, right?
Agreed.
I can't tell you. I read that last paragraph and think, okay, how can I figure out how to steal this, right? How can I figure out how to kind of redo this? And the beauty sometimes is some of the stuff that you steal is so well known that the stealing can be kind of a shout out, right? Can be an homage, and that seems perfectly okay as well.
Yeah, it happens mostly on the micro level, so that's why Van Gogh can, take certain small things and then run with them. Yeah, and writers tend to rip off phrases a lot, and kind of sentence structure things, and they're very canny about disguising their what they've stolen. So, yeah, if they're good artists. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
You weren't born when Black Sabbath was when it first came out.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a lot of for both of you were kind of reaching back in time also. And I was just wondering if there is something about sort of reaching back to a previous generation that also may be involved in influence.
Yeah. I'm much older than you think, so.
I wasn't born when Black Sabbath came out, so I'm much younger than him. Go ahead.
I was 5 when that album came out. I thought it was incredible. I just thought Ozzy was just perfect.
It's a perfect lullaby for Andrew. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I mean, I think that if you're a serious person, you look backward, of course. How can you not be interested in what you've inherited? So it makes absolute sense to look back, and we all do it, right? When you were young, your parents have music around that's of their time, and you become interested in that music, and then you become interested in your grandparents' things and references. So,
but there's also a way in which a lot of it can feel that the past can feel tyrannical in a certain way, right? You're just like, I can't do this anymore. I mean, it's an interesting thing that you say. I mean, you're absolutely right? So that we are kind of like, it speaks to the limited or certain transcendence of some of this work, but it also speaks to how much we give value to the things that have come before us, right? Like, I think that is, I mean, both of your questions are kind of digging around at this exact question, which is, why are we fetishizing the past? Like, what is wrong with the stuff that is being created around us? And I think it's a really important question that you're asking, and it is something that there's a certain kind of lack of dialogue if you're dealing with the stuff that's come from before you, right? Is because it's often kind of what we are told, which is that, if it has lasted this long, there must be something intrinsically good about it. And I think it's perfectly fair to say, well, maybe And I think that that's what's so interesting about our cultural moment right now as well, right? Which is that, and Andrew and I've talked about this a lot, which is while there is some genuine concern about how certain things are, being put away, right? But I do think, in a way, a larger kind of cultural question that we are asking is, why is this stuff that we love so much important, right? Like, why is it, and whose job is it to kind of make that argument for its relevance to our contemporary moment?
Other questions?
Anything else? Thank you all. This was really lovely to spend the evening with you. Thank you.